Hello, and thank you so much for joining Politics for Parents. I'm very, very excited about this episode because I got some time to speak with Rebecca Gale, who is a journalist who is focused on the issue of childcare and affordable childcare. And she's done some really interesting work lately on programs in Vermont where they have really made the decision to invest in childcare and help support childcare providers and offset the cost for working families. And we talked a lot about, how policy change happens and what it looks like when people can kind of coalesce together and form a coalition to champion the issue of affordable childcare and policies that benefit our families. So I hope you are inspired by this episode and you leave it feeling hopeful and you leave it ready to take action in your own community because it is going to take all of us advocating for our families and our children to make things happen. But I think the silver lining is that there is bipartisan support for these issues for affordable childcare, and we're seeing it around the country in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. So if we just educate ourselves, if we advocate, if we work together, we can really make change happen. And I think, the tide is shifting in our favor, and people are really starting to, get involved, get motivated. And I hope this episode helps you become inspired. And I hope you subscribe to Rebecca's Substack and follow her work and, learn from her lessons and decide to take action in your community and find some friends and go advocate. Thanks. Well, Rebecca Gale, thank you so much for taking some time to chat this morning. I know you are a busy mom and a journalist who's super busy on the childcare beat. So I appreciate you taking some time with us this morning to tell us a little bit more about your work and what you've learned in this space.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I am a writer with a group called the Better Life Lab at New America. We focus a lot on narrative change around issues affecting work and gender and equity. And the issue that I have come to focus on quite a bit is childcare. It originally began as covering workplace issues, and I wrote a lot about paid family leave. And paid family leave, if you keep following that extension, it does become childcare because
Yep.
you're giving families time to stay home with a new baby, in addition to other protections that paid family leave offers for people who have like a sick relative or need care for themselves. But after that, what are the options for them if they want to or need to go back to work? And we were finding that people had very different childcare experiences, and it was a huge financial burden for parents who
Yep.
seemed to be very surprised by how much it cost. And it was affecting people's decisions to have more children. It was affecting people's decisions on whether or not they could go back to work, if they could afford to go back to work, if they had more than one kid, for instance. And there were families that didn't even have access to the kind of quality childcare where they would feel comfortable leaving their kids there. So this is a really big problem. And in our country, we do not provide much support in the way of any sort of childcare infrastructure. It is unusual among industrialized countries to not do any of that. And we are seeing some states and localities really take this issue into their own hands and make some of the differences on their level. I can talk more later about why state solutions are not really a substitute for federal solutions, but given this current environment for the next handful of years, that's probably where we're going to see the innovation and the progress happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I have been surprised a little bit myself at some of the things I've learned of and the movements I've learned of, even in the last few months, with some of the groups that I work with around the nation that focus on this issue. There are surprising places in localities that you'd consider like red, that typically aren't friendly to government investments in these types of programs. Um, but I see instances where the business community itself too realizes this is impeding the workforce. This is needed. So there's a lot of, I think, innovation by necessity in some of these places, which is sad in a way because it only is happening because of necessity because people are really feeling the pain on both sides. But at the same time, I mean, I guess something's better than nothing. Um, when did you actually start doing this work? When did you really start focusing on childcare?
Probably about 4 or 5 years ago, like early on in the pandemic. But
Okay.
I have been working on workplace issues for probably close to a decade. And when I was at a newspaper called Roll Call, where we covered Capitol Hill, and I wrote a lot about
Yep.
workplace there. And then 11 years ago, I had my first kid. So 12 years ago, I got pregnant. And I was shocked, like so many people, to see that there were basically no protections for pregnant people from either losing their job or keeping their health insurance. And I was in a newsroom that was going through layoffs, and I was faced with this like very real problem that I could be laid off from my job through no fault of my own and lose my health insurance, and I was about to have a baby. And I didn't think I could go back on the job market very easily. I've written
Yep.
about this before. I mean, and it really opened my eyes to the way we treat, families in vulnerable positions when they're either pregnant and expanding their families, or when they have young children and don't have as much like mobility or flexibility, that we make things very hard for them. And that's sort of the name of my Substack, which is it doesn't have to be this hard. Like we've made a lot of policy choices that make life much harder for families, particularly families of young children, then we need to make them. And you and I talked about this briefly before we got on this call, that there are examples in our country that are alive and well where we've put children's welfare above the convenience of others, or that we've made it a priority. And for a lot of reasons, we have not made caring for young children a priority. We do invest in them at age 5 when they begin public school, kindergarten, and public schools are not perfect. I don't want to
Yeah.
go on that, but there is a decision our country has made that at age 5, we begin investing in children. And before that, we basically leave it up to individual families, which is very hard for families to do on their own.
Yep.
And it is an example of why we make it harder than it needs to be. Other countries
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and when I had both of my children, I was so fortunate to be working in a company that provide exceptional, I'd say, paid leave opportunities, and protections, and they were really great, especially considering I was working in finance at the time. Um, and I have so many friends in the corporate world where we all actually like got treated very, very well, due to corporate practices, because they realized that this was a way to retain workers, to keep employees happy, that was valued. And I really took it for granted, now that I speak to so many more people in this space that do not have those protections, that have not had those policies because they haven't worked in a place where they've valued, their employees in that way. So it's really important to kind of point out that, like, that is where it all starts, is how do you value your employees and their ability to be parents? Because I think there's a conversation I've had with some folks that are maybe men, that are maybe a little bit older, maybe a little bit more conservative, and it's weird with this crowd how they'll say, oh, well, we had all these problems start with our kids when women entered the workforce, and then no one was home with the kids. And I'm like, well, actually, I think the problems that our corporate culture and our workforce really never adapted to parents, and we don't value parenting, we value just working. Um, so it is a choice, right? It's a choice by companies, it's a choice by people to kind of fight for these things, it's a choice by voters. um, and I'd love to hear a little bit about, kind of what you've seen since you've started this work, because you mentioned that you started at the beginning of the pandemic. I had my first child before the pandemic, and then
Mhm.
my second after. And daycare, like, I went back with both of them. I went back at like 10 weeks. The daycare situation was so different post pandemic. Like, what have you seen kind of in that space too, in terms of, like, I guess, increased demand, increased costs? There's been so many dynamics playing in the daycare space.
Well, one thing the pandemic did, sort of like a silver lining to all of the emergency shutdowns, is it really spotlighted the role that childcare plays in our economy. And I think, I call it, my colleague Haley Swenson and I have a story on this where we said, um, the number of childcare stories, increased by some many, many high percentage points, because this was an issue that was basically relegated to like the parenting section of a newspaper if they had one, or like a women's magazine. And all of a sudden, childcare became an economic concern in this really big, in your face way that hadn't really been there before. And then through the American Rescue Plan, childcare centers received a lot of additional government funding, which they had not traditionally received. And for places that have very low margins, that influx of cash was significant. It helped them retain staff, it helped them get caught up with whatever debt they had, improve their space, take on more kids, get credentials. There were so many ways that the extra money was able to help childcare. Again, this is a very low margin industry. So to give an extra several $1,000s is going to make a huge difference. And people who are going without salaries all of a sudden could get paid again. People could give their employees time off to like have a sick day, to allow the employees to bring their own kids to childcare. There are, the joke is there's, a million PhD theses launched on the American Rescue Plan and its spending effects. But the reality was the influx of funds made a major difference in the childcare industry. And the attention paid to childcare sort of gave it this moment of maybe we should do something about this. So from both of those things is how I've seen it change. However, um, the American Rescue Plan funding ran out. Some states have decided to continue it. I do think there is more interest on the state level about why this issue is important to its citizens. And then Build Back Better originally included a lot of funding for childcare, and we all know that didn't pass. And it's something that like that is unlikely to happen in this current administration. However, childcare came up in the campaign, on the campaign trail. It came up in the debates. Like this is
Yep.
the first time for this issue to sort of get this national platform. And we talk about something getting this sort of attention as being in the Overton window when like there's a time now when public policy mindsets could shift about it.
Yep.
And I hope that we might be entering a time with childcare where people are starting to think differently about it. And we also know that this younger generation, the post millennials who are coming up, have different expectations about work and raising families and having access to childcare. That's just different. That the boomer generation of like the sole breadwinner is not the expectation. The millennials sort of had to do the shift, and now we're really seeing people come in and say like, my job is not my life. I don't owe my employee my fidelity, and I want to be a dad or a mom to my kids in a way that I am comfortable with.
Yep. I mean, like with technology and the increased efficiency and productivity as we see, there's no reason to not be able to have that type of flexibility. And I was fortunate to have that in my career for such a long time, and I just can't really see why not. Um, but I do want to talk about something you mentioned, which parents are starting talking about more too, is that the price of daycare isn't high just because like there's somebody raking in it at the top setting this high, like these are really like cost intensive centers to run. um and while we're all struggling to pay these bills, the people providing the care are struggling to pay rent, meet basic needs. Like they're not making a ton of money either. Meanwhile, they're like they're taking care of our children while we're at work, and these are like little kids. um so I'd love to shift into this article you wrote recently about Vermont, because Vermont has made the decision to invest in childcare. And I thought your work on this was really, really interesting. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you learned in your work in Vermont, what they're doing, what seems to be working, and like how did they even make these investments?
Well, thank you for saying that. I have been really interested in what Vermont is doing because Vermont sort of took the opposite approach of we are going to make this easier for families. And part of the reason they did this was because they have an aging population and they needed a strong workforce in the state to keep the businesses that are in the state up and running. And the expectation is that by offering these significant subsidies for childcare and by paying childcare providers more, they will increase the supply of childcare and they will give more families the option to go to work if they choose. Because all of a sudden, if you have kids in childcare at a very low price, it's really a choice as to whether you want to work or not. And then hopefully entice people to move to the state. And so they've made so many interesting changes that I will be covering this for a while because I think that this is the model that potentially other states could take if they decide down the road to do it. They did this through, they said it was like a 10-year effort, essentially. They had a group that was spearheading it. They had a lot of energy. Vermont's also a fairly small state.
Yeah.
They have advantages that other states don't, both in terms of like population size. You can crisscross the state pretty easily in an
Uh-huh.
afternoon. It isn't like it's like a California where there are multiple urban centers with very, very different like needs and populations.
Yep.
Um, and they passed Act 76 with bipartisan support, and they had gotten the business community involved to see what the best way to fund this uh, revenue source to be, and they came up with a payroll tax. So this is a 0.44% payroll tax split between employers and employees. So retirees aren't paying into it, but it's the businesses are. They were able to get enough business support to make businesses say this is worthwhile. I need childcare for my employees, or I need to hire more employees, and I can't get them without this sort of system in place.
Wow.
And the other major thing that they did was they increased the way providers are reimbursed, and they gave them much, much more money for individual children than they had previously. So some providers, if you are a family child care provider and you had like, 5 or 6 kids in your care and the families qualified for subsidies, and they also raised the subsidy rate like very high so that you'd be making like well into 6 figures to get subsidies for children, especially if you had more than one. So if you're a
Right.
family child care provider and the families are making like, $80,000, $90,000, which is enough to live on, but not enough to pay for like really fancy childcare,
Yeah.
your families would qualify for the subsidy through the state, and the state would pay you basically twice the rate you used to receive. So these are
Wow.
family child care providers who have been basically living paycheck to paycheck, barely making ends meet. I had one that said that she had zero retirement savings and she was 60 years old. All of a sudden, they have extra money and they can make improvements to their space. They can think about taking time off. They can actually make the kind of quality living that we've never really allowed childcare providers to do. And that is something I think our country really needs to change. Like we treat childcare providers like low wage workers when the reality is they're taking care of children. It's a very hard, demanding job, and it requires some training and a degree of emotional intelligence that we don't often quantify very easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I- you think about the things that you're willing to spend money on as a parent. I'm willing to spend money on good daycare and things that pertain to my children. This isn't the same thing as buying like a BMW versus a Toyota, like this is so much more important. So I think as parents, we want to make sure that these workers are being paid well so that they can be retained and we can attract really great ones.
Yeah.
Um, so so if you could for a second, so are other states kind of looking to this model? Because this idea of the payroll tax is very interesting to me. Um, and like, do you see other places maybe toying around with this, or is this kind of unique to Vermont and maybe others aren't?
So New Mexico's recently made a big investment in childcare. They came to it
Okay.
through a approach. I'm actually working on some research on that right now, both in terms of how they got this passed. They did it through a ballot initiative, which basically means voters voted on it as opposed to going through the state legislature.
Mhm.
And they also have a bit of money set aside from an oil and gas fund that has done very well, that is specific to New Mexico. Like it's not something that like, I'm in Maryland. Maryland can't just like tap an oil and gas fund if they wanted to do that.
Yeah.
So I don't know what other states will do. I look at like something like paid family leave, which, California is on like year 20 and some states don't have it at all.
Yeah.
So by now, I think there's like 13 states in the District of Columbia that have paid family leave in place. More are going to get it, but that took a long time.
Yeah.
Perhaps childcare is on a similar trajectory. Childcare is more expensive than paid family leave, for sure. I don't know how many other states could pass a payroll tax and have the business community support it. That will for sure take some political savvy and acumen that I think Vermont had. And they had a number of stars aligned for them to do this. There was a lot of hard work, a lot of coalition building.
Yep.
And again, a small state with a lot of concern about its future, also a really strong state identity. Like people in Vermont are Vermonters. They're not
Yep.
like from one town or in the next. They
Yep.
state. And I don't necessarily think that's the same case in other places. But for sure, this is what I'm watching, especially when we aren't going to see much action at the federal level. But I will say, um, the administration has talked about expanding the child tax credit.
Yes.
And even though there are a lot of imperfect aspects to using the tax code as the main way to make things easier for parents. A lot of the reason is because like these tax credits aren't fully refundable, so you
Right.
only get them if you have a tax burden, and they do phase out at a higher level, which in some metropolitan areas like isn't considered as much money. Um, However, what I'm taking away from this is that even the Republicans see childcare and families as
Yeah.
needing more help.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to be like, oh, this isn't going to solve everything, but this is sort of an acknowledgement that things are harder than they need to be for families. How can we make it easier? And if we were to use a tax code, what could that look like?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a lot of things that as like someone and an activist that I find hopeful. One, these are bipartisan issues. We are seeing support across both sides of the aisle and from people who are voters across the board that these are things that we really need to be tackling. Um, and again, you're right. Like to make big policy change, these are all big policy changes. You need kind of that perfect storm of the advocates, raising this issue and people talking about it. You need a policy proposal, right? And a legislative body that's going to pass it. You need so many different pieces to come into play. You need some source of funding that people are going to get on board with. So there's a lot that has to align in order to make these things happen. But I think we are seeing, at least on the very basic sense, the conversation really shift towards it, which is usually where, pressure starts, right? With constituents raising these issues. And in New Jersey, we're not one of two states this year that have our state elections this year. So I'm talking to people in New Jersey about making this a very big issue in our elections because New Jersey's childcare costs are through the roof,
Mhm.
and people across the board agree that that's the case. Um, so we have, I think, one like candidate for gubernatorial elections who actually has a policy paper about childcare and what he would do to make childcare more affordable in New Jersey. And one of the things that talked about a lot that you mentioned is, subsidies and what's the actual income level at which those subsidies kick in. Because, that goes back to right social safety net programs relying on the federal poverty measure, which is antiquated and not sufficient for kind of means testing programs. So at the outset, you have to have a realistic discussion about what these costs are and what's really affordable to people given the cost of
Mhm.
living and everything else they have to pay for. So I think, I'm with you that I'm hopeful that the conversation's happening. And I think a lot of the people that have been working on this, I mean, I'm seeing it around the country, like moms, so many moms groups working on this. Um, so I think there's a lot to be done, but I think we're moving in the right direction, even if it seems at the federal level things are a little bit chaotic. Um,
I hope you're right. I hope you
I,
are.
I hope so. I hope so. But I mean, as you highlighted too, this is a choice, right? Like we can become more active, and that's the whole point of this conversation and this project with Politics for Parents is to get people kind of motivated and informed and kind of understanding like what they can really do because there are things we can do about this. Um,
And
another,
I think
yeah,
also too many parents accept this as the status quo. Well, it's hard, and this is what it is. And it is really hard to take a step back and sort of say, why? Why did we choose it to be this way? And can we change it? And I think getting parents and people, not just parents, and citizens to realize that our policies are deliberate choices and they are changeable. And history has shown that we have been able to make changes before is very powerful in sort of moving people toward a direction of, well, how could this be different and what would that look like? And then how do we get there?
yeah, yeah. And let's talk about that. Can you talk about some of the groups in Vermont that really fought on this? Because I think that's always interesting is to hear about the people who made it happen. Just as a model for anyone else, maybe they think that there's not a lot they can do, and then hearing about how someone else made it happen, they think, oh, well, like I could find a space in that type of a framework or,
Yeah.
you know.
So Vermont had a group called Let's Grow Kids that was like a 10-year advocacy effort and coalition building machine, essentially, that they spent a really long time getting people on board, and they made a really concerted, um, targeted strategitic effort to bring in the business community early and then have the business community do a lot of the reach out within their peer group. So actually, I have a story coming out on this soon, sort of like how
Oh,
like the
awesome.
manufacturing community was able to get on board. Um, and a lot of it was driven by the need to hire more workers. You know, there's
Okay.
one group I focus on. It's called like Twin Craft Skincare. They make lotions and soaps in Vermont. I got to see their factory floor. It was very neat. They said COVID was a huge skincare boom, and they needed to hire almost 200 people to meet demand, and they struggled to hire young people who needed childcare because there were not enough childcare spots in the state. And since Act 76 has passed, the state has created, I think, 1,000 new slots for childcare, which are for children, which is huge. And then all of a sudden, if you want to become a childcare provider, you can make a decent living. You aren't being paid less than minimum wage to do, 14 hours of very exhausting work. All of a sudden, you can hire more staff. You can have a consistent income. The state's paying you, not parents. It has entirely changed the landscape of what being a childcare provider means in the state. And because of that, places like Twincraft can then hire more employees. So I would say that like it's it's takes a while. It takes money, resources, energy to get a group like Let's Grow Kids together. People start now, 10 years from now, they'll see some changes. But starting is a big thing. You've talked about the pre-K you've had in New Jersey. That was also an effort to get there. But and it also, because parenting young children is a very finite time, the people who are working on it now will probably not see the benefits themselves.
But anyway, that's an interesting point too, is that because of this narrow window when your kids are young, you don't have, it's not like, being like pro-choice or anything like that, where like you can stick with it because it's an issue that matters with you. I mean, there is probably natural attrition. Um, Although for me, like, I just, like so many of us just don't want others to have these struggles, right? Because we know how hard it is to be parents in
Goal
these years. So,
that I mean, that's not always traditionally how social policy changes have played out.
mhm.
But yes, like the goal is to say, I want to make things easier for a future generation, even though it was hard for me.
And
And
at the same time, it doesn't end. When your kids enter public school, you still have to contend with summer camp.
oh
You
yes.
have to contend with noon dismissals or early dismissals or snow days, sick days, random holidays, school breaks. So it doesn't end because you still are going to have these times if you work full time that you're going to need care. And, I know with some of the programs we've used in our community, like those costs have gone up in recent years and you still need it would be great to have more support in these areas as kids get older too. So I want to be mindful of time. I feel like we've covered a lot, but I would love to talk about some of the groups, what you're seeing just kind of nationally, some of the groups that are really doing some interesting work. If people are listening and they're looking to get involved on this topic, who should they be following? Are there any legislative battles taking place now they may want to follow or weigh in on if it's in their, state or district? What are some of the ways folks can kind of get involved and kind of continue to follow this and maybe become more active?
Excellent question. I may not be the best person to speak to on the advocacy. I think some of my colleagues might know a bit better about how to get involved specifically. I think it would start with just look at what's going on in your state or local area about childcare,
Uh-huh.
and then connect with the childcare providers around you. Ask
Yep.
what do they need? What
Yep.
like a lot of, childcare can kind of be the wild, wild west because a lot of it's administered on the state level. So they have very different rules about ratios and quality metrics, and family childcare versus like a childcare center. So a lot of it is understanding the issues that are affecting the people in your community. Some people may have not no access to good quality childcare. Some people may have access to childcare but can't afford it. Some people may have access to childcare and can't afford it, but the providers aren't being paid very well. So you sort of have these like very different problems within the system. And I think that if someone wants to get involved, I would start by sort of talking to the childcare providers around you. And then doing some of what you said, if you have a candidate running for office, what is their childcare platform? The
Yeah,
idea that more candidates are having platforms on childcare shows how far the issue came.
yeah,
It used to be
absolutely.
entirely, in the background, faded. And also, I think there's something to be said for people who are not yet parents, seeing this as something that they will want to invest in for the future, and people who have already been parents, seeing this as still something important, even though their kids are no longer at those ages where they need full-time care.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things I talk about a lot on this podcast is, the power of your voice in your state legislature. I mean, people all the time when they call their state senator for the first time and someone actually answers the phone, or maybe they get
Yeah.
the senator themselves on the phone, they're surprised at how accessible they are, because a lot of people really overlook the importance of their state government. So that is one thing I would say is, not only starting a conversation in your community, talking to other childcare providers, talk to other parents, talk to people in your legislative district about this issue, and call your representatives and say, hey, like, I know we can do something about this, and I'm really feeling the pain. What's your plan? I mean, these
Mhm.
people do represent us. We vote
Yeah.
them in, we can vote them out, and we can really set their agenda. If you get a bunch of friends to call or visit the office, um, that does, like, they hear you. So I would say, advocate for everyone to know who their state reps are and call them on this issue. And number two, I think some of the groups that I'm working with that are doing some really great work about this, Moms First, they've really been elevating discussion at the national level. Their founder, Reshma Sajani, was, at the Club of New York, and she asked that question of Donald Trump during the presidential race. So they've done a great job elevating the issue. Mother Forward is one of my favorite advocacy groups. I know that they're planning some actions in April, highlighting this, where, moms are going to be visiting reps or doing other actions to really highlight the need for family-friendly policies and childcare. Chamber of Mothers, I think, is another one. There's so many groups working to advance this issue. And I know from discussions with other advocates at the state level, there are policies in some states just sitting with a friendly legislature, um, and people ready to pass it. It just hasn't been prioritized. So I think, your point of just talking about it with providers, with others in your community, that's how these things start, is by talking about them and making sure, you find allies, and maybe just start your own little coalition. Just start calling your reps, start talking to people, because that's how these things become, a priority, is when we make them a priority, right? So.
Yes.
Great. Well, and I also want to encourage people to follow your Substack. It
Thank you.
doesn't have to be this hard. I think, there are so many other things I wanted to even bring up in this conversation. We didn't have time just because there's so much great information in your Substack. So everyone should follow your Substack. Um, and also your work. Where can they follow your work and subscribe to your work through your publication if they want to support you?
Better Life Lab doesn't have its own publication, but I do write a lot for different publications. But Substack is probably the best way to read what I'm working on. I'm also on Instagram. I'm Rebecca Gale Writing. But I really welcome the chance to talk with you about this. I think these issues are so important, and I love your call to action for parents. I just really want to emphasize that you a lot of the way we think of parenting in this country is a policy choice that has been made and does not have to stay this way. We've changed things before, we can change things again.
And actually, I'll close with this one passage from your article that I love. So you wrote this article called "Can We Actually Change Policies?" And you talk about this analogy to when you take your kids to the bus stop and that red flashing sign comes out, and people patiently wait for your kids to get out of the bus. And this is a time where you actually see people prioritizing children above their own need to get someplace fast and their own comfort. And we really do take the time and invest in kids when it matters. And you wrote, I realize that the bus flashing red stop sign is not quite the same as, say, a 0.44% payroll tax increase, which is how Vermont is funding its own near universal childcare program, or the congestion pricing fees, which are $9 for most vehicle at peak times. That's in New York City. But what it does show is that we are sometimes willing to put kids' needs above other people's conveniences and wishes. If we can do it before, perhaps we could do it again. What we need is to change the mindsets that accept this lack of social support as the way things have to be and realize that they, like most policies and the people who make them, are subject to the wants and needs of the electorate. I thought that was just so well articulated and it encapsulates kind of my feeling on these issues, but you're a writer by trade, so you did it better. So thank you for that, and thank you for your voice and your work. And I am really hopeful that the more folks like us collaborate and continue to talk about this stuff, I think, we can make some great things happen. So our daughters maybe and our kids don't have to kind of have the same battles that we've had.
That's the goal. And even the generation above them, even people
Yep.
who are in college now and not even thinking about what having kids is going to be like, that when they approach parenthood, they think this is something that is worth doing and my community supports me. So
Yep.
thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation, Nicole.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome.